Why, at 11 at night, am I driving through a torrential downpour to my mother's house? Why am I out here, drenched and alone, while Ethan and the kids are cozy and likely asleep back at home? And why is he threatening divorce when I haven't even done anything wrong? What in the world is going on here? Why is everyone shutting me out? My name's Lily Thompson, though, professionally, I still use my maiden name, Carter. Ethan never had an issue with that. He got how much it meant to me. I'd worked hard to earn my degrees and certifications in clinical psychology before we married, and he respected my wish to keep my name professionally. He was supportive like that. That's also part of why we waited until I was 26 to get married. That wedding day, just over 9 years ago, still stands as one of the happiest days of my life. It was the perfect balance. Not too extravagant, not too simple, and all our families were there to share it with us. My dad, David, even showed off some pretty impressive moves on the dance floor. He'd been taking dance lessons for a good 15 years by then. That's how he met Anna, his wife now. Technically, she's my stepmom, but they didn't meet until I was 17, so she never had a hand in raising me. My mom, Susan, was there too, with her fourth husband, Frank. It was no small feat getting them all in the same room peacefully, but we pulled it off. I even spotted Mom at the same table with Dad and Anna while I was out on the floor with Ethan. After the traditional father-daughter dance, Ethan and I were eager to start a family right away, especially since we'd put off marriage for so long. Now, we have Oliver, who's 8, and Henry, who's 6, a girl and a boy, 2 years apart. Just like me and my younger brother, Benjamin. I know it sounds silly, but having 2 kids close in age like my brother and me feels like I somehow got things right. And tonight, here I am, miles from home, wondering why I'm the one who has to leave while my family stays put. I should be back there, in my own house, with them. Ethan should be able to push through his feelings and accept that things are just as they are. I want to go home. I want to fix things with him, but I'm not welcome. And I guess I should explain why. I got home early today, as planned. I'd picked up all the ingredients to make Ethan's favorite meal, my mom's meatloaf recipe of all things, and a nice bottle of red wine. I had Idaho potatoes, sour cream, chives, Wisconsin cheddar cheese, and some Brussels sprouts, though I know not everyone likes those. I roast them with olive oil, salt, and pepper until they're just right. For dessert, I'd even made a key lime pie. And, well, I'd bought some little things from Victoria's Secret, hoping we could make the weekend special before I left for a conference he didn't yet know about. I planned to tell him after dinner. It took almost an hour to get everything ready. With the meatloaf in the oven, I cleaned off the table, vacuumed the dining room, laid out our best place settings, and even had time to shower, fix my hair, do my makeup, and slip into this new blue dress I'd bought, the one that really brings out my eyes. I topped it off with the necklace Ethan gave me on our 5th anniversary. The kids were okay with the meatloaf, but I still had to make them some mac and cheese since they wouldn't touch the potatoes or sprouts. As soon as Ethan got home with the kids, it was like a little storm blew in with them. Oliver and Henry charged around the house like they usually do, and it was a miracle we managed to get them to change their shoes and put their things away before dinner. I served their food, got them settled, and was just pouring the wine when Ethan joined us. He looked at me, a bit surprised, eyebrow raised, so I tried my best to give him the warmest, most adoring smile I could. But somehow, that only seemed to make him more wary. Dinner went smoothly, though. Everyone seemed pleased, and the kids dug into their food. They even had a little slice of key lime pie for dessert, though Henry didn't like it, saying it tasted sour. Oliver was happy to finish his piece for him. Once they were settled with their favorite movie, a classic they'd seen dozens of times, Ethan nudged me back into the dining room, where he'd already tidied up and loaded the dishwasher. He poured me the last of the wine and poured himself a bit of Glenmorangie, neat, before taking his seat. Then he asked if I'd care to explain the reason behind tonight's setup, wondering why I couldn't just surprise him for no particular reason. I joked that it didn't need to be a birthday or anniversary to enjoy a nice evening and tried to make light of it, but he wasn't buying it. It's just Friday night, I told him, which only led him to dig a little deeper. So, finally, I let him in on my secret. I'd be heading to a conference in Chicago for 4 days starting Tuesday. I needed him to play single dad for a bit. His face changed as he took in the responsibility he'd have to juggle with the kids. Trying to lighten the mood, I teased him about the fun weekend we'd have before I left and hinted at the welcome back he'd get once I returned. He seemed doubtful, though, raising an eyebrow as he asked why I was just mentioning it now. I told him it was a recent invitation, that I hadn't known about it sooner. But no matter how much I tried to reassure him, it only seemed to bother him more. He stood up, told me to stay put, and muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated, trying his hardest not to let his anger show in front of the kids. He told me to put the kids to bed, saying he needed time to gather his thoughts before we continued our conversation. I watched him grip the chair with a tense, frustrated energy, then shake his head and head upstairs, leaving me to mull over how everything had gone so wrong. For the next 20 minutes, he stalked around the house like a caged tiger, unsettled and brooding. Every few minutes, he'd glance at his phone, scowling at whatever he was reading, muttering curses under his breath as he resumed pacing. Eventually, he made a call, leaving a message that chilled me. "It's Ethan. She's acting just like Susan. It's happening right now. Call me as soon as you get this." What was that supposed to mean? Acting like Susan? My mom had nothing to do with this. I barely had time to process before his phone rang. He slipped outside to take the call, throwing a cold glare my way on his way out. Clearly, whatever he was saying wasn't meant for me or the kids to hear. He came back inside, still on edge, and after a few brief moments, he was out the door again when his phone rang once more. The kids noticed his odd behavior but, thankfully, didn't seem too fazed. As their movie wound down, he vanished into the kitchen, and I heard the coffee grinder going. Oliver and Henry went through their bedtime routine without much resistance, brushing their teeth and getting into pajamas like they sensed that something was off. The unease was getting to me, too. What was Ethan so worked up about? What did he know? And why drag my mom into it? Once the kids were in bed, I headed downstairs to find Ethan waiting at the table with a full pot of coffee, 2 mugs, and his Yeti cup. He motioned for me to sit, and I did. He poured the coffee, insisting I drink, even though I said it would keep me up. "You're going to need it," he replied, his voice low and unyielding. I pressed him to just tell me what was going on, and he told me he would, if I would, insisting there was nothing wrong. He brushed it off, saying I was making a fuss over a simple conference, a one-time thing I needed for myself. I tried to get him to level with me, questioning why he was acting this way, but he doubled down, claiming he'd already told me everything there was to know. He took a sip of coffee, grimacing, which prompted me to ask what was wrong. Ignoring my question, he asked me if I thought he was stupid. "Of course not," I replied, taken aback. But then he went further, asking if my psychology degree made me think I was smarter than him. I told him no, that I respected him as my husband, partner, and person. He wasn't satisfied, though. He said that if we were going to talk, I needed to be honest, no half-truths, no sugarcoating. He warned me that he knew more than I thought, so lying or trying to manipulate him wouldn't end well. I assured him I'd never try to deceive him, but I hinted that maybe he was misinterpreting things. He wasn't convinced. Instead, he asked how long I'd known about the conference, pressing if I'd only just found out. I told him, honestly, that I'd mentioned it that night because it had come up recently. He pressed on, asking if I'd known about it before Tuesday and implying that I'd planned the evening just to butter him up before telling him. I tried to explain that it wasn't like that, but his silence told me he didn't buy it. He asked who had invited me, and I told him it was a colleague. He then questioned who was paying for it all, the fees, the airfare, the hotel. I mentioned I'd pay it back, but he demanded a clear answer on who was footing the bill initially. He brought up our account statements over the past few months, suggesting I either planned this far in advance or had secret accounts I hadn't told him about. I tried to reassure him that he had nothing to worry about, but he wasn't buying it. Then he dropped a bomb, asking if Michael Reed was attending the conference. My heart sank. That mocking voice in my head taunted me, calling me foolish, but I silenced it. Ethan couldn't know anything for certain. Trying to sound casual, I admitted Michael might be there since he was presenting on Wednesday. Ethan pulled up the conference agenda on his phone, hinting that he found it odd I wouldn't know my good friend Michael's schedule if we were so close. I confessed I'd known about it but had forgotten, trying to brush it off. Ethan wasn't having it, though. He told me to cut the nonsense, reminding me that he wasn't a fool. leaving me with no excuse to cling to. He began laying out his theory. Weeks, maybe months, ago, my older colleague, who he believed had some romantic designs on me, invited me on an all-expenses-paid trip to the city, and I'd said yes. Ethan accused me of keeping it a secret until the last minute, throwing romance and intimacy in his face to keep him occupied with the kids and ensure he'd stay out of the way. I protested, insisting he had it wrong, but he reminded me that he'd warned me about lying, to him and to myself. I stood firm, telling him I wasn't lying. He just looked at me, his face stony, and asked how long I'd been involved with Michael. I denied it, saying there was nothing going on, but he pressed on, asking if Michael had ever been involved with me or if anyone else had been. Out of nowhere, he asked if I knew the capital of California, like he was testing if I was even thinking clearly. My mind raced, trying to reassure myself that Michael didn't know anything he shouldn't, that Ethan was grasping at shadows. I kept reminding myself that Ethan was my husband. He had to believe me, but he wouldn't relent, accusing me of being lost in some fog of deception and scrutinizing my every expression, as if he could see the guilt he was so sure I was hiding. I firmly denied having any kind of affair, but Ethan, watching me closely, suggested maybe I just hadn't crossed that line with Michael yet. He must have seen something shift in my expression because I quickly explained that Michael had invited me to the conference about 6 weeks ago. I assured him we'd be staying in separate accommodations and that I'd planned to pay Michael back for any costs he'd fronted. I tried to convey how important this conference was for my career and begged Ethan to believe me, reminding him of my loyalty to him and our marriage. Ethan just sat there, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, and remarked how he preferred things straightforward, pure. He accused me of ruining that simplicity, of tainting it by plotting everything in secret, piling on lies and deception. He claimed I'd betrayed him, though he couldn't yet pinpoint the extent. I took a steadying breath, reassuring myself that, technically, I hadn't done anything wrong yet. But he wasn't letting up, saying I was setting myself up for intimacy with Michael, preparing to cross lines, even if I hadn't yet. Reluctantly, I admitted he wasn't entirely wrong. The guilt stirred in me, leaving me unable to say anything else. Then he asked about the lingerie I'd bought. He'd already seen the charges on the account. I stammered, explaining it was meant for him, for our weekend together and for when I got back, though I didn't plan on packing much for the trip. He looked at me sharply, asking if I'd bought any of it specifically with Michael in mind. I faltered before admitting that, well, maybe some of it was. Ethan's face hardened, his distrust plain as he emphasized that I'd given him more than enough reason to feel concerned. He set his mug down with a weight that made the seriousness of the moment clear. Then he laid it all out, telling me to leave the house and stay with my mother. He said he'd already informed her, along with Ben and Laura, so they were expecting me. I protested, calling this whole idea absurd and saying he couldn't just force me out like this. He shot back, saying the real absurdity was that I was heading off on a honeymoon with someone else and expecting him to be fine with it. He reminded me that we'd dealt with similar issues before, warning that if I didn't learn from this, our marriage wouldn't survive. Ethan's tone was deadly serious, and I argued that he couldn't control me. He was my husband, not my boss. He acknowledged that, but he made it clear that if he didn't approve of my actions, he'd file for divorce, framing it as a necessary partnership matter. Despite my shock and protests, he insisted on ending things, saying we could deal with the details later. He calmly stated he'd be hiring a lawyer the next day to start the divorce process. He suggested that if I wanted to avoid any legal fallout, I should follow his instructions and leave for my mother's tonight. He reassured me that Mom was fully briefed and expecting my arrival. My phone rang right then, and Ethan urged me to answer. It was Mom. She sounded serious, telling me to listen to Ethan and not do anything I'd regret. She mentioned bacon cookies, then hung up, leaving me bewildered. A moment later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my brother Benjamin. He told me he'd set up the spare room for me, which now doubled as a nursery, and that I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. He emphasized I should call on my way, even if it meant waking them up during baby feedings. When I hesitated, Benjamin insisted I be there by morning, threatening to cut ties if I didn't cooperate. He told me, flat out, that he wouldn't take sides against Ethan, saying he believed Ethan was right and even hinted at some family curse. Before hanging up, Benjamin threw in that he planned to take everyone to IHOP the next morning, as if that settled it. Left alone with Ethan, I asked him what exactly he'd told Benjamin and the rest of my family. Ethan rose from his chair, saying he'd told them the truth, claiming their insights had been helpful. He then told me to finish my coffee, pack a bag, and said he'd even make me a caramel latte for the road. He reassured me he'd manage the kids, update his family, and hold off on telling Chuck and Bethany right away to avoid breaking the news to my dad, who, Ethan knew, would be crushed. Feeling a mix of confusion and fear, I pressed him about what Benjamin had mentioned, the family curse. Ethan shrugged, suggesting I ask Susan, as she would soon be my primary confidant. Then he got up and started on that caramel latte, which I took to go after adding some extra skim milk and 2 Splendas. With my 16-ounce Yeti of double-shot non-fat caramel latte in hand, I made my way to the car, grabbing gas and taking a couple of pit stops along the way. Finally, I pulled into Mom's driveway just past midnight, feeling a mix of dread and exhaustion. As the garage door opened, I parked in the empty bay, surprised to see that Brian's car wasn't there. Mom greeted me warmly, saying how glad she was that I'd made it and hinted that things would have turned out much worse if I hadn't come. She invited me inside, mentioning there were fresh cookies in the kitchen and offering tea. At 60, my mom still had that refined elegance about her. Her posture was flawless, and despite her age, she hadn't started to shrink or stoop like many women do. Her dark hair, streaked with a bit of gray, still looked thick and stylishly arranged, and her blue eyes, just like mine, were still bright. I could only hope I'd look half as good when I hit her age. She poured tea without asking, and I quickly mentioned that I was already jittery from the caffeine Ethan had practically forced on me, coffee and a double shot that left me on edge. Mom assured me that it was chamomile, gently patting my hand. She glanced at my outfit and noted I was still in the same dress I'd been wearing when I last spoke with Ethan. I explained that he hadn't even let me change before kicking me out, so I had to grab whatever I could and leave in a hurry. Mom's expression grew serious, and she exchanged a look with Benjamin, who muttered, "Oh my," under his breath. When I asked what was wrong with the dress, they shared a look and Benjamin referenced something about the curse. Confused and craving some clarity, I pressed for answers, mentioning Benjamin's odd comment and asking what on earth was going on. She handed me a ginger snap and suggested we move to the sitting room to talk. There, I noticed the TV was paused on a football game, which was odd because Mom had never cared for sports. When I asked where Brian was, she explained that he usually stayed with his longtime friend Brian, a relationship that had been ongoing for almost 20 years. I felt a pang of confusion, wondering why Brian, an admittedly attractive man, was even married to my mom. She went on, sharing a complex story of societal expectations and pressures that had led them to marry. Although gay couples had more acceptance now, Brian had a complicated relationship with his own identity. Despite being in love with Brian, he didn't fully embrace a label. For him, his relationship with Brian was unique but didn't define him as gay. Mom explained that Brian didn't feel any shame. He just didn't see himself fitting into a label. They used the term beard, an old-fashioned setup where a man and a woman marry to meet societal expectations while still maintaining separate private lives. When I asked if she was gay herself, she assured me she wasn't, but she admitted to being a terrible wife in her own words. She reflected on how her actions had damaged her previous marriages, especially hurting my father. She got choked up as she talked about how much she had loved him and confessed that seeing the love between Ethan and me had hit her hard. She urged me not to repeat her mistakes, not to let things go down the same path. Overwhelmed, she started crying, and I sat there, feeling a mix of empathy and confusion. She excused herself, saying she had something to show me. I watched her leave, hearing her rummaging through one of the spare rooms. My eyes drifted to the TV screen, and I realized it wasn't paused on a game but on 2 middle-aged male commentators who looked like they'd probably been football players in their heyday. Mom returned, carrying a blue dress in a clear dry-cleaning bag. She explained that, while it wasn't identical to mine, it shared a similar shade of blue and style. She wore it the night she and my dad's marriage came to an end, nearly 30 years ago. She admitted she kept it without fully knowing why, whether to remind herself of her mistakes, keep a connection to my father, or simply because it made her feel beautiful. She wore the dress once more earlier this year for her birthday, but that only dredged up more regrets. She recalled the February night when they were snowed in, a Valentine's Day celebration that never happened, and how she ended up spending the evening with me and someone else instead. It was a leap year, stretching the month even longer, and she couldn't shake the feeling of melancholy. She reminisced about a group of wives, all close friends, and their husbands. Although we all seemed friendly as couples, things were different when it was just us women. There was an undercurrent of gossip, secrecy, and even schemes we'd share over coffee or wine. One of the wives openly cheated on her husband, bragging about it, while another was planning an affair with a coworker. Strangely, we all encouraged her, though thankfully her husband caught on before things went too far. I had avoided those paths until one day I didn't. She told me about a local sports star who prowled the bars, taking pride in targeting married women, relishing the humiliation of their husbands. He thrived on the thrill of wielding that kind of power over other men, playing on his charm to turn heads and stir up trouble in marriages, as if it were a game to him. He'd lure these women to his hotel, where he'd make the experience so unforgettable that it ruined them for anyone else. Being rich, charming, and famous let him do it over and over without consequence, his behavior becoming something of an open secret among women who craved excitement. I couldn't say how many marriages he destroyed, but it was definitely more than a few. To him, this was just a game. One of his favorite hunting grounds was a dinner dance hall connected to a nearby hotel. Our group of restless wives, a mix of cheaters and those teetering on the edge, decided to take our husbands there on February 29th, Leap Day, as a way to reconnect with each other, or so we told ourselves. You and Benjamin spent the night with the Porters, and we each had a hotel room ready for the evening. What our husbands didn't realize was that bringing them there was like buying a ticket in a twisted raffle. Jack Lawson would choose one lucky woman to be his companion for the night. That's what thrilled us so much about going, knowing there was a chance one of us might get picked. I glanced at the TV screen again, and there he was, Jack Lawson, the commentator on the left. His name was displayed in bold letters on the screen, confirming his identity. Seeing him like that, it hit me like a punch to the gut. Jack Lawson had been my mom's infamous boyfriend. My head spun with the revelation, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dizziness and nausea. As I struggled to piece it all together, my memory was hazy. I vaguely recalled staying with May and Grandpa during that time, sensing something was wrong while Dad was gone for a while when I was just 6. Mom admitted that my parents had tried to shield me from the worst of it, hoping I'd remember as little as possible. In those weeks, Dad had left suddenly, seeking counseling to salvage the marriage, though that attempt only backfired. Frustrated and betrayed, Dad stormed off to Atlanta for 10 days, not telling anyone where he'd gone. That was when he started accepting short-term work out of town, slowly distancing himself from a marriage that had already begun to crumble under Mom's actions. Then she revealed another painful memory, how Jack had approached their table that night, leading her onto the dance floor without even asking. They danced through several songs, and at one point, Jack leaned close, telling her to slip out the back with him. When she returned to grab her purse, she came face to face with David, who had watched everything. He even covered for her, diverting Dad's attention so she could leave unnoticed. That moment marked the end of their marriage, though the official separation and divorce dragged on for over a year. With regret in her voice, Mom admitted how unbearable that period was, but added that the worst part wasn't the separation itself. It was the realization that, even without Jack, she would have ruined her marriage eventually. She admitted that she'd gone down the same destructive road with 3 different husbands, trapped in a pattern of self-centered choices, blinded by her sense of entitlement. And she saw that same trait starting to take root in me. She explained that such behavior was hard to recognize from the inside, but her hope in sharing her story was to give me a chance to see it before it was too late. This whole conversation, she said, was her way of trying to intervene, hoping that if I saw my own actions in her story, I might make different choices. Mom continued, sharing memories of her marriage to David. It had been solid and deeply loving, with Dad as a devoted partner. Yet, when Jack Lawson, A man who promised to make her feel glamorous and free for one enchanting night entered the picture. She couldn't resist the temptation. After that night, she had foolishly believed she'd be able to go back to Dad, thinking his love would heal whatever hurt her betrayal had caused. After hearing it all, I must have fainted. I came to, sprawled out in my mom's recliner, with her pressing a glass of water and some cookies into my hand. She told me I'd been unconscious for about half an hour and suggested I stay up, given everything swirling around in my mind. I mumbled that I planned to go to bed, but she doubted I'd managed to sleep much after our conversation. Admittedly, her story had touched a nerve, and she could see that in my face. As I sat there, the dry cleaning bag with her old blue dress beside me, she voiced her concern that I might repeat her mistakes, that I was heading down the same road of ruin. She didn't hold back, asking if I was destined to ruin every marriage I entered, whether I'd taken my husband for granted while secretly seeking excitement elsewhere. She said that although I hadn't crossed the line yet, it was clear I was getting close. She urged me to listen to my inner voice, to acknowledge the signs before my marriage fell apart. When she asked if I felt conflicted inside, she saw my hesitation as a good thing, though she sighed with the weight of the journey ahead. She admitted that, as a psychologist, she'd become a master at silencing her own voice of reason, rationalizing actions she knew were wrong. The thrill, the excitement, and the validation she'd craved had blinded her to the damage she was causing. She could see that I'd begun rationalizing the same way, convincing myself that it was harmless to entertain the attention of another man, drawn to the exhilaration and sense of worth it gave me. Mom warned me against the destructive belief that Ethan's forgiveness would be some kind of shield, one I could hide behind to excuse my behavior. She compared it to a medication taken recklessly, one that could end up doing more harm than good. She stressed the broader fallout, how my choices would ripple through Ethan, Oliver, Henry, Benjamin, herself, and even my father. The thought of Dad, of all people, having to see this vicious cycle play out again was unbearable to her. Digging into our family history, she clarified that May, Reed, hadn't been unfaithful, so this wasn't just some genetic flaw. But Gamma Nora, my dad's mother, was a different story. While David's father, William, was gravely ill, Nora had carried on an affair with a man named Peter, eventually marrying him after William passed. That marriage quickly fell apart, riddled with mutual betrayals, and then Carl entered Nora's life through a cancer support group. My father distanced himself from Nora at first, deeply hurt by what she'd done to his father. Eventually, though, Dad forgave her, even befriending Carl. But forgiving Mom, his own wife? That took nearly 2 decades. He did it for my wedding, as a gesture to me, though Mom admitted she felt undeserving of that grace. She confessed that, in those days, she'd apologized only to smooth things over, dismissing Dad's feelings as his problem. Mom went on to say she'd been proud of her affair back then, a pride that she could see now had been the whole point, an arrogant sense of entitlement that drove her actions. She feared the idea of being single, she admitted, so she clung to marriage as a crutch, unlike Dad, who had wisely taken his time before getting involved with someone else after the divorce. Mom recounted how she'd given Jack her number that first night they met, which set off a cascade of calls and messages. Before she even realized it, she'd been swept up into one of Jack's favorite bars, his playground for picking up women, sliding into yet another cycle of relationships without a moment of real self-reflection. She admitted the 2 weeks that followed were particularly low points. On St. Patrick's Day, at an Irish pub, she'd acted shamefully, continuing her secret meetings with Jack while trying to salvage her marriage with Dad. She had convinced herself that whatever she did with Jack had no bearing on her relationship with David, fooling herself into thinking that what he doesn't know won't hurt him. Looking back, she could only describe herself as foolish, her behavior self-destructive. Then she told me about her most desperate act, playing a fake phone call where she pretended to break things off with Jack, hoping to convince Dad she'd ended it. Jack didn't stop until the divorce was final, at which point he quickly moved on to his next target, a married woman named Diane. By then, Mom had already arranged to marry Mark. Mom stressed that the story didn't end with Dad and Jack. Her poor decisions spilled over into her marriage with Mark as well. She admitted Mark had been a decent guy, though nothing like David. She married him because he was there, available. And while she could have made it work, she chose not to. She was half-hearted about their marriage, fully focused on raising Benjamin and me in the family home, seeing herself as a part-time wife at best. Her rationale was that if Mark really loved her, he would put up with her choices. To her, it was simple. He had no choice but to go along with her life. She believed her own needs and choices should take priority over their relationship, that Mark just had to accept it. She told herself she wasn't depriving him of anything and loved him in her own way. Then came Paul, the next chapter. She'd entered that relationship with a clear expectation that it would be open-ended, knowing she'd continue seeking something outside the marriage. Paul was on board with the idea of having other partners, essentially cheating on her, and she chose to ignore it, seeing it as her penance of sorts. Although she never truly loved Paul, they stayed married for a while, and their arrangement persisted as we kids grew older. But eventually, feeling overlooked, she began seeking attention elsewhere, reasoning that if an open marriage worked for him, it should work for her too. What she didn't realize was that Paul didn't see things the same way. Her miscalculation led to a final unraveling, which brought Frank into her life. She admitted Frank was the best husband she'd had since Dad, but even then, she'd taken him for granted, convinced he'd forgive her no matter what. Her worst confrontation with Frank happened after my own wedding, when she focused on patching things up with Dad and completely disregarded Frank's feelings. Dad had to pull her aside to tell her she was treating Frank with the same disregard she'd shown him, Mark, and Paul over the years. As she recounted these memories, her voice cracked and tears flowed freely down her face. She wanted me to understand how easily a pattern could take hold, how one choice could slip into another until the entire foundation of a marriage was eroded. Her life was a warning, and in her eyes, I was on the brink of making the same mistakes. I could only stare at my mother, stunned and nauseated by the sheer weight of her confessions. My arms shook as I bolted to the bathroom, barely reaching the toilet before everything came up. Mom was right there, holding my hair back, staying close as I retched. She tried to soothe me, sharing her regrets, her long history of mistakes, and the selfish choices that had left her life in pieces more than once. Her voice, heavy with remorse, laid out her tangled relationships, the countless broken promises, and the habitual search for some fleeting escape outside her commitments. She admitted to her weaknesses, her selfishness and carelessness, and as she spoke, I couldn't help but see my own life mirrored in her words, the shadows of choices I seemed so close to making. It was as if her cautionary tale held up a mirror to my own struggles, as if she were showing me the wreckage my actions might bring. She talked about that blue dress, how she'd worn it to catch attention, how she'd taken her husbands for granted, each time believing she was invincible. Her words churned in my mind as violently as the nausea in my stomach, each realization hitting me harder than I could have anticipated. She described her life as a cycle of self-destruction, and I felt trapped on the same road, seeing myself in her tearful confessions, unable to look away from the reflection. In a trembling voice, Mom shared that she'd married Frank almost as a mercy, to protect him from the hurt she'd caused others. Trying to comfort her, I placed my hand on her arm, but with every word, I felt my own turmoil surfacing. When she began speaking directly about Ethan, the reality of what I'd done, what I'd been risking, made my stomach twist again. The weight of everything, of all the truths, regrets, and looming decisions, overwhelmed me, and I collapsed onto the bathroom floor. My vision blurred from both exhaustion and emotion. The room spun, not just from my physical sickness, but from the whirlwind of memories, regrets, and warnings she'd woven into my mind. Mom's life had been a tapestry of heartbreaks, tangled choices, and missed chances, and now I was caught in its threads, facing the hard truths of her story and the reflection it cast on my own. Mom didn't let up, though. She gently encouraged me to purge everything, to let go of the negativity I'd been holding on to, emphasizing that repeated self-destruction only ended in misery. She told me, her voice full of sorrow, that the last thing she wanted was for me to follow in her footsteps. Amid my shaky breaths and pounding heart, I questioned my own actions, internally condemning myself for disregarding Ethan's warnings, for allowing myself to spiral down a path that might destroy my family. My self-criticism was relentless, doubting whether I even deserved a husband like Ethan or the happiness we'd built together with Oliver and Henry. I feared I was destined to become exactly like my mother, each mistake leading to another failed marriage, alone and burdened by regret. After what felt like a lifetime, Mom handed me mouthwash, then made me eat a couple more ginger cookies, promising they'd calm my stomach. She brushed my hair and let me change into comfortable clothes, her own sweats since we were the same size. Bundling me up in her car, she drove me over to Benjamin and Laura's house, only 2 miles away. She'd cried herself dry by then, but as she helped me inside, she updated my brother on my condition, assuring him that I'd come to grips with the consequences of my choices. Benjamin thanked her, mentioning that Christopher and the baby were asleep, something they cherished whenever possible. Mom kissed him goodbye, saying she'd be back for pancakes whenever I was ready to face the day. Benjamin guided me to the nursery, saying it wasn't in use yet, but would make a quiet place for me to sleep. Little Lila was in the master bedroom, nestled next to her mom in a crib-like extension attached to the bed. He promised he wouldn't give me a lecture, saying that Mom had likely done more than enough of that. He knew I'd spend the night processing everything, wrestling with my choices, but he wished me a restful sleep anyway. Before he left, he stopped and hesitated, then decided to tell me something about Ethan. In a calm, brotherly way, he told me that while he hadn't spoken to Ethan since I'd left, he wanted to share something he felt was important. He reminded me that Ethan wasn't just some passive, forgiving guy. I might be forgetting that he was a fighter. He explained that Ethan had once been an Olympic fencer, and he'd spent years working as a combat consultant and choreographer for movies and theater, knowing what it meant to be in a real fight. As Benjamin described Ethan as a fighter, those words lingered, echoing through my mind. It was as though I could feel the weight of it. The realization that Ethan wasn't just someone who would roll over and forgive everything. He was someone who knew when to stand up and fight, and he would fight for his family too, if that's what it took. The depth of his strength and conviction became startlingly clear, and the weight of that truth, mingled with the night's revelations, stayed with me as I lay down, my mind churning, my heart heavy, and my path forward suddenly laid bare in stark reality. My brother's words painted a vivid portrait of Ethan, casting him as a warrior of unwavering commitment, the kind who would defend our family with all his heart and strength. Though Ethan had never served in combat, Benjamin likened his determination to that of a Navy SEAL, someone relentless and deeply protective. Hearing it laid out that way, that Ethan would go to great lengths to keep our family safe and united, hit me powerfully. It was a clear reminder that any attempt at deceit would be futile. Ethan knew more than I realized and would never let us falter without a fight. In a surprising twist, my brother shared that Dad had spoken to Ethan before our wedding, warning him about potential challenges. It was that classic son-in-law talk, but this one was tailored to prepare Ethan for the specific risks that came with being married to me. I was struck by the lengths my family had gone to, hoping to prevent me from following a path they seemed to fear was inevitable. Benjamin's willingness to intervene brought me a strange sense of peace, a feeling of security wrapped in his big brother protection. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in what felt like ages. The emotional storm that had been raging within me finally began to calm, settling into a stillness that felt new and, somehow, lighter. The next morning, I woke up to the comforting chaos of family life. Kids bursting with energy, shoes strewn about, and toothpaste trails left behind in the morning rush. In this different setting, there was a warm nostalgia for the early, messy years of parenting. As we all gathered for breakfast, I watched my brother's family with a new kind of appreciation. His wife, Laura, was radiant, balancing her grace as a mother with the athletic build of her gymnastics days, her gentle Belgian accent adding to her calming presence. I could see how my brother's protective instincts extended to her, building a secure home for their family. Breakfast wasn't just pancakes that morning. It was a shared meal laced with emotional release and hope for a fresh start. The conversation stayed light, moving away from all the heaviness, allowing us to just be a family together. Later, as Mom arrived in my car to join us, she mentioned a little something she'd left in the back seat. Curious, I looked, and there it was, her blue dress. This gesture felt significant, like her way of letting go of a painful part of herself. Though it was a relic of another era, Mom joked about it coming back in style. She handed it to me with a soft smile, saying, "I guess you could call it vintage. You're an adult now, a beautiful one. Make your own decisions about what to do with it. Just, please, don't use it to break your husband's heart. And for heaven's sake, don't let your father see you wearing it. It'd probably give him a heart attack." I smiled, finally able to say, "I won't, Mom. Thank you." We exchanged our goodbyes, I love yous, and thank yous, and I felt an unexpected swell of gratitude for everything. The hard truths, the tears, the wake-up call. Sitting in the driver's seat, I took a breath and typed out 2 messages. The first one was to Michael. "I'm canceling my trip to Chicago. Cancel the flight, the hotel, and the conference registration, and request a refund. I don't care about your plans. Find someone else. You nearly destroyed my life, my marriage, my family. From now on, unless it's strictly professional, don't contact me. And don't even think about crossing paths with my husband or my brother. For your own good, steer clear." The second message was to Ethan. "I'm so sorry for putting you through this. I regret acting without you in mind and promise I'll never let you feel this way again. I won't take you for granted, underestimate your strength, or put anything above you. Thank you for standing by me, for making me see what I'd risked. From now on, I'll be the one to hold myself accountable, knowing what our family history has cost. You deserve more than I've given, and I love you more deeply for being willing to fight for us. I promise, never again." As I began the drive back home, a sudden thought crossed my mind about what I needed to do with Mom's dress. There was only one way to break free from its history, from everything it symbolized for both of us. I would destroy it.